Singapore has almost none of the things that usually make countries rich. No oil, almost no land, almost no agriculture, and not even enough fresh water of its own. For decades, a large share had to come by pipe from a neighboring country. By all the usual rules, this should be a poor country, but it's one of the richest places on the planet. By income per capita, Singapore beats the United States, Germany, and Britain. How did a country with almost nothing under its feet become richer than countries that have almost everything? The answer isn't under Singapore, it's around it. And by the end of this video, you'll see why having no resources turned out to be more than just Singapore's weakness. It was one of the reasons it built a system that could produce wealth again and again. First, you have to understand how strange Singapore's start really was. It's a small island, almost no land for farming. Most of its food comes from abroad. No oil, no gas, no mines. Even construction sand has to be bought. For an island, that one already stings a little. But the most serious problem is water. There's plenty of rain here, but no big rivers, no huge lakes, no rich underground stores of fresh water. So for years, Singapore got a large share of its water from Malaysia. Picture the scale of that dependence. You can have banks, skyscrapers, one of the largest ports in the world. But if your neighbor shuts off the water pipe, all of it suddenly becomes secondary. You can live without oil. Even sand, it turns out, you can buy. Water is a little harder. And here's what really matters. If wealth were created by natural resources alone, Singapore should have been one of the poorest spots in Asia. But the map shows something else. Because Singapore's main resource never sat inside its borders. It passed right by. Look at the shipping routes between Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. Everything moving from the Indian Ocean toward the South China Sea passes through one narrow point, the Strait of Malacca. Oil from the Persian Gulf goes to China, Japan, and Korea. Containers from East Asian factories head to Europe. Raw materials, fuel, machinery, goods. A huge share of global trade runs through this corridor. Every year, tens of thousands of ships pass through here. Now look at where Singapore sits. At the southern exit of the strait, right where the routes converge into one narrow bottleneck before splitting apart again. This isn't just a good stretch of coast, it's a shipping hub on a global scale. And here's where the difference between a resource and a position becomes clear. A resource can be extracted, sold, and one day, run out. A position can earn again and again, as long as the flow keeps passing by. Venezuela sat on top of its wealth. Singapore sits across someone else's wealth, passing by every single day. It doesn't need to pump oil. It doesn't need to grow grain. It doesn't need a huge domestic market. It just needed to make it worth a ship's while to stop right here. But here an obvious objection comes up. Singapore isn't the only shore of the Strait of Malacca. If it's only about location, why didn't all that wealth spread along the coasts of Malaysia and Indonesia? Why didn't a second Singapore appear next door? There are hundreds of kilometers of coastline there, plenty of room, the same flow of trade. Three things matter here. First, the harbor. Most of the coast around the strait is shallow, muddy, or covered in mangrove swamp. Large ships need deep water. And Singapore happened to have a natural, convenient harbor in exactly the right spot. Second, the point itself. Not just somewhere on the strait, but at its southern knot, where the sea routes converge before heading out into the South China Sea. But if deep water and a good position were enough, a second Singapore would have appeared nearby long ago. It didn't. Because the third reason isn't geological anymore. It's human. In 1819, the British set up a trading post here, and then they made Singapore a free port. At a time when other ports charged duties, Here they told merchants, "Come in," and the ships started coming in. Then around the ships came warehouses, repairs, financing, insurance, banks. The more business gathered here, the more it paid for the next ship to choose Singapore too. A network effect had begun. A ship doesn't care which port deserves the trade. It goes where it's faster, easier, and cheaper. Geography gave Singapore its start, but the wealth was built by the machine constructed around that geography. And the real test of that machine was still ahead, because in 1965, it could all have ended almost immediately. In 1965, Singapore became independent. But it wasn't the kind of independence people usually celebrate. It was expelled from Malaysia, basically kicked out. Now look at the country's position. A tiny island, almost no resources, almost no countryside, no large domestic market. And the water still comes from the country that just showed you the door. The cost of a mistake here was enormous. But it was exactly the lack of a safety net that forced Singapore to do what resource-rich countries can put off for years. A resource country sometimes gets a second chance after a mistake. The price of oil rises again, gas gets more expensive, grain brings in new export income. Singapore had nothing to fall back on. And so it began turning weaknesses into industries. No oil? Refine someone else's. Singapore became a major center for oil refining and energy trading, without a single oil field of its own. No huge domestic market? Serve the global one. Ports, logistics, finance, insurance, international business. No water of your own? Learn to make your own. Collect the rain, treat the wastewater, desalinate the sea, put water back into the system. Singapore had no plan B. Geography didn't even leave much room to store one. And slowly, something strange happened. Every shortage forced the country to build a skill. Having no resource meant learning to serve someone else's resource better than anyone. Having no market meant becoming useful to the world's market. Having no water meant becoming obsessed with water. That's why Singapore didn't just use a lucky position. It made that position far more valuable than it was on its own.
And here's where the whole story flips. What looked at the start like Singapore's greatest weakness, almost no natural resources at all, turned out to be the very thing that kept forcing it to build. If they had found huge oil reserves under Singapore, the story might have gone differently. Easy resource income would have eased the pressure to keep improving the port, the infrastructure, education, and human capital. We can't know for sure what would have happened, but we do know this. Singapore had no easy resource to replace efficiency, so it invested in the things that don't run out after the last well: the port, the laws, the people. That's Singapore's real asset. Not oil, not ore, not land, but a system that makes someone else's goods, someone else's capital, and someone else's ships choose this tiny dot on the map again and again. But even here, there's a risk. Routes aren't forever.
Alternative land corridors appear. Every so often, the idea of new canals and bypass routes comes back. Singapore understands this better than most countries. So its main task isn't just to sit in the right place. It's to stay so useful, so efficient, and so convenient that the world has no reason to go around it. Go back to the beginning. Singapore has almost nothing. No oil, almost no farmland, no ore, not enough fresh water of its own. By the usual logic of rich countries, this place shouldn't even be among the wealthy. But now you can see we were looking in the wrong place. Singapore's wealth never sat under its feet. It passed by. Resources are what a country receives. Position is opportunity. And wealth is created by what a country builds around that opportunity. Singapore was unlucky with resources, but lucky with its point on the map. And the absence of easy money forced it to turn that point into a system the world couldn't ignore. So the real paradox of Singapore isn't that it grew rich in spite of geography. It grew rich because of geography. Just not the kind people usually look for underground. The world has a structure. Let's keep finding it. One question before you go. If they had found huge oil reserves under Singapore back in the 1960s, would that have made the country even richer? Or would it have taken away the need to build the very system that turned it into Singapore in the first place? Tell me what you think in the comments. Some countries get rich from what lies beneath them. Others get rich from what passes by them. Singapore is one of the purest versions of the second kind. Subscribe if you want to keep breaking down countries not as a set of borders, but as a system of causes.